So in this video, I want to show you the final component. So far we've looked at the views, and you've seen the Racer view engine. We've looked at the controllers in the previous video, how those controllers are made and how they connect data to our views. The final part is the model part, which is basically where we have our data, right? So this is where all those objects are stored. And we haven't really looked at anything so far because everything, we just left MVC to deal with everything that we've been doing. So now let's look a bit deeper into how that model part of MVC works in ASP.NET MVC. So first of all, let's take a look at the database itself. You'll see that I'm just opening the Server Explorer here now, and I want to connect or look at the connections that we have available in our model. These are the DB contexts that we've made. Now, we've just left MVC to create everything for us, and then by default, unless we do something, the scaffolding engine will create a local DB for us, which is available here. It'll store that information in the web config. I'll show you that in a moment. And basically, that's how it knows where to store data, right? So, but we can obviously, if we want to move this into production, this is now still a development environment. If we want to move this into production, there's ways of accomplishing that, and then basically fixing or setting those connection strings to our live data, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But let's for now just look at these two different databases that we have. First of all, it's the default connection. This is just the name of it, by the way. It's not a strongly named or anything like that. It's just a reminder. This is the default database that MVC created when we set up the project the first time, and it contains the users that we have. So we can basically now click on this to see the users in our database. We'll see the tables here, and it'll contain the users and the roles and everything like that that's used for the authentication and logging on. So it's not really that interesting at this moment, but let's look at that leads context that we created, because this is where we store our custom models, right? So far the only model we created is a lead. And you'll see that there's now in our database or our leads context, there's a table called leads, right? So now we can actually right click on this, and we can open that and view the data inside this, right? And that will open an explorer that will show us the data that's in that database. So here you'll see that there's now an ID here, which contains the GUI that we created. There's a name for it, and there's an email for it, right? So this is what we'd expect, because we actually have our data. That's what our model looks like, and MVC has taken care, or actually the entity framework is doing this part, takes care of creating that table for us, adding the correct rows and the column, or the correct columns, and the properties on those different columns depending on what our model looks like. And that approach is called the code first. I mentioned this earlier. It's called the code first approach to entity framework. If you already have a database, there's another way you can do that, which is called the database first. And what you do then is you basically do the reverse. You start out with the database, and then you have the entity framework generate the C# or .NET classes for you, right? So it works the other way around. In code first, you start with a .NET class, and it'll create a database for you. In database first, you start with a database, and it will create the classes for you, right? So those are the two different approaches that are most common in the entity framework on doing that. I'm not going to talk about the database first model at all. I'm a programmer. I prefer to do my stuff with classes and programming. But there are definitely cases where the database first model is a much preferred option, especially, as I said, if you have existing data. So what does it actually do? Well, I mentioned that it stores this information in what's called the web.config file. So the web.config, think of that as the metadata for our application. And no, that's the wrong one. This is actually a cascading thing, so we need to look at the root one. This is the meta information about your web application that you're building. So in this case, now you'll see that there are two connection strings that are available here. One is called the default connection, and the other one is called the leads context. Right? This is the one that MVC created for us, or when we scaffolded out that default controller. And you see that they have these names here: default connection and leads context. These are the same names that appear in the data connections for this particular web application. Right, and the connection string, again, that's a string that tells the data engine how to connect to that data. In this case, here's the data source, here's the initial data that we're going to be working with, some stuff that has to do with how you connect to it and things like that. The cool thing, though, is that these connection strings can connect to pretty much anything, right? There's a ton of different data types or database types that you can connect to, whether it's Oracle or MySQL or Postgres or whatever type of engine you have. You can even build your own if you have some kind of proprietary database that you need to connect to. So these connection strings basically tell the entity framework, how are we going to connect to our data. And if this was stored in, some kind of external database, we have a separate SQL server or something like that that's running and we have all our data, you can basically just, connect to that by replacing this connection string with that live database that you want to connect to. And you can even have multiple of these so that when you are developing and debugging, you are using this particular database, which isn't, live data in any way. And then when you publish it, you put it online, and to put it into production, then you change the connection string to use the real data, right? And obviously that also, if you are working with something like, the MVC web API connections, when you're creating API controllers instead of web forms or Razor views, then you can just use the same connection, and suddenly now you have another approach to accessing that same data. So this is stored, as I said, in the web config. Tells the entity framework how am I going to find my data, and it basically from there takes over and allows allows you to simply work with writing code to get your database management handled for you. So really smooth. However, our lead is kind of simple right now. Right? It has a name and it has an email. It's not really much of a lead unless that's the only thing you want to connect to them. If that's the case, then fine. Stop watching this video. You're done. You can publish this online, and then suddenly you have your leads engine. But what if you wanted to add something? Let's say that, well, great, we have leads. People sometimes also have phones. I don't, but some people have still phones, mobiles, or landlines. So we may want to add something to our model, right? So, and again, this is where stuff isn't as pointy and clicky as it used to be. We actually need to do some additional stuff here. And this is something that happens quite often. You have a pretty good idea of what you want. You build that and you put it into production, and then someone said, darn it, we should have had that phone added, right? So the approach I'm going to do now is actually going to be something you only do in development. I'm doing that now because it's a quick and dirty way of accomplishing exactly what we want to accomplish. If the approach that I'm taking is that I'm basically just throwing out the database if there are any changes to my model. So if I make a change here now, I'm going to show you first what happens. I'm going to add a new property. We're going to call that, okay, let's make it simple and say that this is going to now be the phone number, right? So if I were to run this, I'll run this now. MVC will actually, tell me there's a problem here, because now my model no longer matches my database, which is a problem because, how are we going to keep working? So I'm just going to show you what happens and how we're going to fix it. It's not going to be tleads, it's going to be /leads, right? So now that we do that, in just a few moments, we should get an error message like that. So it'll actually jump into Visual Studio now because we are in debugging. It'll tell you that, the model backing the leads context has changed since the database created. The model has changed, we've added something, so it doesn't really, match the database anymore. So when you are doing this in development, and if you don't really care about your data, you can take the quick approach. And I'll just show you the quick approach, because that's what we're, often, or at least I do often, when I'm just building something out and I have no idea what my model is going to look like yet. This happens all the time. You change the model and you like to just start from scratch. You don't really care about the data that's in there. It's just test data anyway. So in order to do this, what you basically do is you set an initializer on that context. So if we now go into our, I may actually need to cheat on this, by the way, because it's something I don't really do that often. I just usually copy my data. So what you will do is that you will, I'm just going to copy this first, make sure it looks correct before I explain what I'm doing. So this is the context. This is the data context. You can see that it inherits from DB context. That's obviously the class that does all the plumbing for you. So this particular subclass of the DB context, which is our lead context, it has it's very simple. As you can see, not much you actually do when you just start out by default. There's one thing here which is important to us, which is the set, the DB set, which is called the DB set, of those leads that we have created, which is stored in a property called leads, right? So this basically makes sure that we can query the DB context, or our leads context, for the leads, and then behind the scenes, all the magic, or not magic, but the entity framework will make sure it goes out to find the correct database and correct table and gathers the data and does all of that stuff. That's what it does. This is basically as simple as that code is, and then there's tons more you can do in here. Again, keeping it very simple for now. But we also want to make sure, or in this case, I want to handle that problem of our model changing. And in this case, I'm going to do something, like I said, dirty and simple. I'm going to set the initializer for this particular database of this lead context. I'm going to set it to a new instance of something called the drop create database if model changes, right? So if I'm changing the lead model, I'm going to drop the database. I'm going to take that table, throw it out, and I want to create a new one. So I'm basically starting from scratch every time I change that lead. In production, this is something you'd never do. You do something different, right? The recommended approach is something called database migrations. And it's actually fairly simple once you get it up and running, but it requires a bit more explanation. But basically what you do is you first of all, you run a command which is called enable migrations. That creates or that adds some artifacts to your solution, which basically from now on is going to be the way that you handle changes to your models. And then once you have enabled migrations, you can create these sort of snapshots or updates that you are going to have on your database. So in our case, for instance, when we added that phone number, the update is going to be, well, take this existing database, add this column, and then, that's what you need to do. You can then, if you need populate it with default data or something like that, you get basically, SQL code that you can use to update the database however you want. And then if we were to go back, migrate down, then you can, remove that column and disregard the data. So that's what you would do in production. In this case, where we're just, playing around and we don't really care about migrating all the data all the time, I'm just going to, drop the table whenever something changes. So by simply doing this, right, now I've said, whenever the model changes, drop the database. So now we can run this again. And we can go into our leads controller like that. You'll notice that the first time this now spins up, it's going to take a bit longer. And that test person we created earlier is going to be gone, right? It's not there anymore. So let's see what happens. And by the way, there's more we need to do, but let's at least make sure that our database now is going to be dropped and then recreated based on our new model. And as you can see, now it takes much longer because first of all it needs to now connect to the database and then throw out the existing data table, and it's going to it's not in use. Sorry about that. It's because I already have that running. So let me just quickly stop this. This is because we opened it earlier. So I'm going to isn't there a disconnect or something? No, there's no disconnect. How do I do that? Let me see if it was only to... Let me just try that again. Sorry for that mistake. But if nothing else, you at least saw that it was attempting to drop that database. I might need to actually, disconnect Visual Studio or close it down and then restart it. There's certainly a way to do that without restarting. I just don't see it right now how that's happening. So I'm probably going to get that same mistake again. And if that happens, we're just going to close down this window and then do the same thing with Visual Studio and going to restart it. And that should take care of it. Yeah, we can't drop it, as you can see, because it's currently in use, which certainly isn't the case. So I'm going to kill Visual Studio. I'm going to kill this window. And this is the code that I copied. So let's just go back in here and reopen our lead solution. And obviously that has in the meantime removed our current connections. So we can now fire this up. It's connected somewhere. I am not really sure where it is. So, and now when we go into leads, it should at least, if we shut down properly, it's going to kill that existing database and recreate it for us. And then we can open it up again and we can see, that our new data model now, here you can see. Now we can go in, open our Server Explorer. Hang on, I just need to stop this. We can open our connection like that, go to leads, go to our tables. Then we open the leads database, we show the table data. And now you'll see that there's a new column here for that phone that we added. And as I said, if we had done this in production, well, obviously we'd never drop the database in production. But if we had done it in production and used that database migrations framework, or functionality that's already in the entity framework, then the same result would have happened. We've just seen that now we had that phone number or phone column added to the database. So let me see if I can actually figure out how it was right there all the time. Close connection, right? So that's how we would have done this earlier without actually, disconnecting or restarting Visual Studio. So that threw me out a slight bit. Where were we? Yeah, we were looking at this leads context. So behind the scenes, this is, creating this as now, this, for all intents and purposes, represents our leads in that database. We don't need to worry about how we connect to it, which update commands we run, which create commands we run, how we, query the data or anything like that. The entity framework takes care of all of that for us. And it's actually pretty complex. There's certainly things you cannot do here. For instance, you can't, if you have classes that have other classes, it's not that easily, there's some conventions that you need to do in order to accomplish that. Now, I'll actually, create a more advanced video later where I show you where we can create a second type of classes and link that to the leads. For instance, if you want to track lead activities, I call this person on that particular date, or they sent an email to us on that particular date, those kinds of actions that you want to track on your leads, then there are certain conventions you use to link those two object types together, and you'd be surprised at how easy it is. And if you follow it correctly, then everything will just work smoothly, right? If you don't, then you'll have tons of problems. Okay, so the other thing that I want to do, so let me just quickly now fire this up again, and I want to show you some stuff that's not here already. So first of all, one thing you'll notice is that when we spin this up, and we'll go to our leads again, like that, and then we will see that the index now still only has name and email, and we don't have a phone, right? which is kind of bad because that's the point of adding a phone. And if we go into create a new item here, we'll still only see name and email. How do we add the phone here, right? Let's first of all, let me do one thing. Let's add a new test person again, keeping in mind that when we drop the database, all of the data just disappears, right? So we'll create one now. Even if we now go into the details, you see there's only name and email here, no phone ever anywhere, right? So this is obviously, we need to do something more here in order to make sure our forms work. So two ways we can accomplish this. First of all, we can manually update the views. So we learned earlier that the view used for the leads and index is stored in the views and leads and index, right? So here it is, right? So the manual way of accomplishing this is that we can go in here now and we can say, well, in addition to these two existing columns of this table, I want to also do this for the phone, right? Hang on a second, phone, like that. And so we now need the table header for the phone. We now also need, of course, the data for the phone, right? So I'll just copy and paste this again. We'll go in here and say dot phone. Come on. Note, by the way, that we have a strongly typed model here. So you get IntelliSense, which means that you now can, it helps you with typing correctly and stuff like that, because, that's good. So now that we've updated that, we can basically just fire up this view again. When I'm starting, by the way, from watching this view, it'll actually take me directly into that leads / index. So I actually go directly to that view that we are currently working on, which is, convenient sometimes, at least. So now we should have, when it opens up again, we'll have a separate column now for phone, right? So this is fine, but it's work, and I don't like that. So we can see if we can do something simpler. We still don't have, I didn't show you that, but we still don't have any correct form for adding the phone, right? So we need to do that. And of course, we can now still, in the leads create form, go in to do exactly the same thing. We can copy this entire thing and we can say, add this for phone. But it's actually easier if we just say, well, let's drop this. We don't need it anymore. We'll take that entire create view out of the picture. Because what we want to do is we want to create a view from this method here, right? This is what we want to do. And Visual Studio has, and the templates here, have the ability to create a view for you. So notice that I'm right-clicking now inside this particular method, and I'm going to say add a view, right? And just by that, it'll figure out that, okay, it would be cool to call it create. I would like to create a create template, right? This is what I want to accomplish. And I want to do that for the leads model, right? So by simply doing that, I can say add, and you'll notice on the right side here now, it'll create, scaffold this new create view for us with those based on this new updated version of that create view that we already had to create, or that we have updated. And again, notice this bug here. This is only for the create one. No idea why that hasn't been fixed, but still, just remove that. And now you'll see that the scaffolding has actually added that phone number for us. So if you now just fire this up again, and again, I'm just firing it up while I'm looking at this create view, so we go directly to that create form. We can then go in and we can say, test user, or whatever we said was the, again, slow machine. Takes a few moments to actually get that, get all the rendering. Now you see that the phone is here. So we'll say test, something like that, test 2. So this is now going to be a test 2. And we have a phone, which is, 111-222-444, something like that. Doesn't really matter. We'll create that. And it's actually one thing I forgot to do. So it doesn't actually add the phone, because you remember one thing, and I certainly didn't, so you'll be perfectly excused if you didn't. You see that the phone wasn't added, and the reason for that is basically that we didn't tell our controller to allow us to include the phone number, right? So we have this list of things that we would like it to include. So this just showed you how it won't actually allow you to take that phone number in, because the only thing we allowed it to send us was the ID, the name and the email. We also need the phone, right? So we just add that as a text column. We'll go back to the create one. We'll create test number 3, actually, in this case. That should allow us to save the phone number. So let's try this now. Once the form comes up again, this will be test person 3, like that, test 3, like that, and we'll have an email, which is going to then be obviously test3@example.com, like that, 345-444-222, something like that. Doesn't really matter. Now that we created that, we have also allowed the controller to receive that phone number. Now you'll see that it actually appears here, right? So we still don't have the details showing this, right? And we need to update that, and perhaps we need to do something here as well to just show that we're deleting the right. We actually said test 2. Well, it's supposed to be test 3. That doesn't really matter. But there's a lot of views that we need to update or recreate, right? So an even simpler way, and this basically just works if you just created the model and you haven't really done anything with the controllers, and you haven't really added the fancy stuff like special views or filtering or stuff like that, is that we can basically say, screw everything. We just go back to scratch. We'll kill this entire leads controller. We will kill this entire folder of leads here, and we'll just recreate that entire leads controller. As I said, that works if you haven't really done any development work by creating anything fancy with that controller. So that's how you would do that. So this shows how you can update the model. We've taken this lead and we added the phone number so that when we allow the entity framework to handle all of those connections for us through the connection strings in the web.config, it'll go out to that database, it'll drop the data for us and recreate it for us. We talked briefly about the update framework, which is how or update the migration methodology or methods or whatever you want to call it. When you have data in production, obviously you don't want to kill that every time you make a change to your model. We talked about how you would do that. Maybe I'll create a video later to show you actually how you do that. And then finally, we saw or walked through the steps of actually making that update, which is in the model itself, extremely simple, and slightly more work in the views because you basically need to update them either manually or automatically. So that's basically been the components that I wanted to show you in these videos. Is intended to be a brief introduction, again, not trying to sell anything, but just showing you that you can actually rapidly get most of the plumbing that people often do, whether you're writing PHP or Perl or Java or whatever. Well, some languages and some frameworks are better than others, but here's an example of how you can quickly build web applications within a few minutes, just getting stuff up and running and not needing to do any of that plumbing stuff, while still, which is extremely important, retaining the control of every single step of the way. You can override and you can work with exactly how you want to have every step of the every step of the process. You can override everything. You can take out and plug in your own engines if you want to have different rendering engines or database engines or even controller if that's your fancy. So that's as I said, the videos that I wanted to record for you and show you a brief introduction. So I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, reach out to me and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. And as time permits, I'll try to create some slightly more advanced examples as well, and maybe show you some of the data migration, some of the when you're creating relationships between different entities. For instance, these activities for leads and stuff like that. which again, fairly simple once you know how to do it, and actually very smooth in terms of how you handle it in the MVC framework. So that's it from me, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll look forward to hearing your comments and questions.